bright spots of the Twilight Zone madness of 2016 was the resurgence of Mark Sanford, the disgraced former governor of South Carolina who had to resign his position following the revelation of his extramarital affair. However, in a brilliantly ironic twist of fate, Sanford then went on to win a seat in the House of Representatives and became one of the most staunch moral and ideological opponents to the excesses and abuses of President Trump. Unfortunately for Sanford, he lost his primary Tuesday night to Katie Arrington, a woman who decided to spin the election as a litmus test for Sanford, who, despite having voted with President Trump 73% of the time, she claims had not sufficiently displayed his enthusiasm to join the president in his bid to make America great again, an assessment which President Trump himself joined in on. Now, the very idea that Sanford voted with the president's agenda 73% of the time is in itself somewhat counterintuitive to the idea that we have separate and co-equal branches of government. The president has every right to lay out the ideas which he would like to see passed into law by Congress, and which he would then presumably sign into law, but he has no actual authority to force Congress to pick up any of these ideas. This is, of course, because Congress is the sole authority with legislative power in this country. The president has absolutely no legislative authority, despite the fact that his ability to sign a bill into law is a check upon Congress's ability to just pass willy-nilly whatever it wants to. And the idea that we adjudicate the voting records of not just Sanford, but various representatives in Congress based on how they vote with the president and his expressed interests really undermines the separation of powers and suggests that the legislative body has some sort of duty to pass the president's agenda. And this is a view that is supported in part by the way that parties exist and by the idea that the president is the de facto head of whatever party he represents, and the entirety of the political party then during the tenure of that president is dedicated solely to advancing his agenda, rather than the president reflecting the ideas and the ideological beliefs that are at the plank of the party, and that these should be what informs everything that the party does. In that case, really, the president would be a reflection of that and would be subverting himself to the party's agenda. Although, of course, it wouldn't really be subversion, because presumably the president agrees that those are the correct moral ideas that should inform public policy. But that is not the current case of what we have in government. Rather, we have this idea that the president is empowered almost like some sort of monarch to really guide the entirety of the policy-making process around his ideas. And this is encapsulated pretty well in the president's desire to make America great again. And really the difference between Sanford and Trump is that Sanford is a committed ideologue, and he has principles which he applies to everything that he does, to every decision that he makes. And he's not alone in that in Congress, though he's certainly in a vast minority of people who do that. And the president is not an ideologue, even though we hear over and over again how he wants to make America great again, because he never articulates these values and these principles. Make America great again is just an empty epithet. And the difference between what people like Sanford do and what the president does is Sanford bases his actions on principles that are clearly articulated, and he explains them, and he doesn't attempt to bully others into going along with his line of thinking. However, for the president, his morality is tied up not so much in ideas and principles, but in his ability to interpret them and to apply them to political goals. Make America Great Again, as I just said, is really an empty epithet. It doesn't mean anything. The only meaning that is imbued into it is that which relies on the president's judgment. And when anyone disagrees with the president's judgment, as we can see in the case of Mark Sanford, then they automatically are positioned as someone who must not be willing to make America great again, whatever that means. This gives the president a great deal of flexibility and a great deal of unilateral power because he's really the only one who can interpret this. And anytime you go up against it, that's not moral opposition. Rather, that is some sort of enmity. The idea that, well, Sanford doesn't want to make America great again, therefore he's an enemy, therefore he is actually working to actively undermine us, and therefore he needs to be eradicated. Again, even though Sanford voted with the president 73% of the time, not out of any desire to support or to undermine the president's agenda, but based on his own belief as to what was the correct vote in the legislation that came forward. And the difference between that is Sanford's actions are a reflection of his own principles. He looks to his own reason to tell him what the action that is reflective of the morality he believes is true is, whereas the president attempts to impose his will on the rest of us and believes that by doing so, he's actively acting in our own interest. Of course, he's taken away the ability for us to define our own interests for ourselves. So his is a collective judgment, whereas Sanford's is an individualistic judgment. And Sanford really, the difference of this is clear in the fact that despite the fact that Sanford has spoken out against the president's behavior and some of the abuses of power which the president has undertaken, hasn't really done anything to rein the president in other than perform the functions of his office in accordance with what he thinks are their limitations. And the same thing can't be said for the president. And that's the difference between them.